In December 1997, 7 experienced hikers set out to summit Frozen Ridge in the Colorado Rockies on Christmas morning, seeking adventure and holiday memories. By sunset, all 7 had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their abandoned campsite and a trail of questions that would haunt investigators for decades. But when an avalanche reveals something impossible buried in the ice 27 years later, the truth proves far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and the dark secrets hidden in our most remote places, subscribe now and join us as we uncover what really happened on Frozen Ridge. The December wind howled across Frozen Ridge, carrying with it the bite of winter and the weight of silence. Snow fell in thick sheets, obscuring the jagged peaks and deep ravines that made this stretch of the Colorado Rockies both beautiful and treacherous. Somewhere beneath the accumulating drifts lay answers that had eluded search parties, investigators, and grieving families for nearly 3 decades. Sarah Chen stood at the base of the mountain, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she studied the terrain through binoculars. At 62, she had spent half her lifetime searching for answers about what happened on Christmas Day 1997, when her younger sister Jennifer had disappeared, along with 6 other hikers. The official investigation had concluded with frustrating ambiguity, attributing the disappearances to probable avalanche or exposure, though no bodies were ever recovered. But Sarah had never stopped looking. Every winter for 27 years, she had returned to this mountain, walking the same trails, studying the same maps, hoping for some overlooked detail to surface. The other families had gradually given up, moving on with their lives while carrying the permanent weight of unanswered questions. Sarah couldn't move on. Jennifer had been 23, vibrant and full of dreams, planning to start medical school the following fall. She deserved better than to become another cold case file gathering dust in a storage room. Sarah lowered her binoculars and pulled her jacket tighter against the wind. The forecast predicted heavy snowfall over the next few days, the kind that would make the upper trails impassable. She had maybe 48 hours before she'd have to descend and wait out the storm. 2 days to cover ground she'd covered dozens of times before, to search for clues that probably didn't exist. As she began the familiar trek up the lower slopes, Sarah's mind drifted to the last conversation she'd had with Jennifer. Her sister had called on Christmas Eve, excited about the planned hike, describing the group she'd joined through an outdoor adventure club. 7 hikers total, all experienced, all properly equipped. They'd planned to summit at dawn and return by evening, spending Christmas night at a lodge in the valley below. They never made it to the lodge. By the time search and rescue teams reached their last known location 2 days later, the campsite was empty. Tents still stood. Sleeping bags remained in place. But the hikers were gone. Most disturbing were the personal items left behind, things no experienced hiker would abandon. Wallets, identification, even winter coats. It was as if they had simply stepped out of camp and vanished into the mountain itself. Sarah paused at a familiar landmark, a lightning-scarred pine that marked the halfway point to the old campsite. She'd climbed this route so many times she could navigate it blind, every switchback and boulder committed to memory. The families of the other missing hikers had established a small memorial here years ago, a weather-beaten plaque bearing 7 names and a simple inscription that time had begun to erode. She touched the cold metal briefly, whispering her sister's name before continuing upward. The snow fell harder now, reducing visibility and making the trail treacherous. Sarah knew she should turn back, that pushing forward in these conditions violated every safety protocol she'd learned over decades of mountain experience. But something pulled her onward, an inexplicable urgency she couldn't name or ignore. Higher up the mountain, where the wind carved the snow into strange formations, and the temperature dropped below zero. Something waited beneath the ice. Something that would finally answer Sarah's questions and reveal a truth far more terrifying than simple tragedy. The mountain had kept its secrets for 27 years, but winter was about to give them back. The coffee in the Summit County Sheriff's Office tasted like burned rubber, but Deputy Marcus Holland drank it anyway, staring at the computer screen that displayed the morning's incident reports. Most were routine for late December: fender benders on icy roads, a few domestic disturbances fueled by holiday stress, one report of teenagers joyriding in a stolen snowmobile. Nothing that required his immediate attention on what should have been a quiet morning shift. His phone rang just after 9, the caller ID showing a number he didn't recognize. Marcus picked up, expecting another tourist reporting a lost wallet or asking for directions to the nearest ski resort. Instead, he heard the shaking voice of Tom Bradshaw, the owner of Ridgeline Helicopter Tours. "Deputy, you need to get someone up to Frozen Ridge," Tom said, his words coming fast. "We just spotted something during a scenic flight. There's been a massive avalanche on the eastern face. Must have happened sometime last night. But that's not why I'm calling. There's something exposed in the ice field. Looks like it could be human remains." Marcus sat forward, his attention sharpening. "Can you give me exact coordinates?" Tom rattled off the location while Marcus pulled up a topographical map on his computer. The area Tom described was high on the mountain, well above the tree line in a section rarely accessed except by the most experienced climbers. The eastern face was notoriously unstable, prone to avalanches and rock slides that made it dangerous even in good weather. "How many bodies?" Marcus asked, already reaching for his radio to contact search and rescue. "That's the thing," Tom replied, his voice dropping. "From the air it looked like more than one. Maybe 3 or 4, hard to tell with the ice and debris. But Deputy, something else you should know. They were wearing bright-colored jackets, the kind hikers wore back in the 90s, not recent." Marcus felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the winter temperature. He'd been with the department for 15 years, long enough to know the stories about Frozen Ridge and the unsolved disappearance that haunted the area. Every local law enforcement officer knew about the 7 hikers who had vanished on Christmas Day 1997, the massive search operation that followed, and the frustrating lack of answers that eventually forced the case into cold storage. "I'm sending a team up immediately," Marcus said. "Can you meet us at the ranger station with photos if you took any?" "Already on my way," Tom confirmed before ending the call. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes coordinating with search and rescue, the county medical examiner's office, and his supervising sergeant. Within an hour, a team was being assembled, specialists in mountain recovery operations who knew how to work safely in avalanche-prone terrain. The weather forecast complicated matters. Another storm system moving in that would close the window for safe recovery operations to perhaps 36 hours. By noon, Marcus was riding in a helicopter with 3 search and rescue specialists, approaching the eastern face of Frozen Ridge. Tom Bradshaw had been right about the avalanche. A massive section of the mountainside had given way, exposing layers of ice and rock that had been hidden for decades. In the midst of the debris field, Marcus could see what had prompted Tom's call: dark shapes visible against the white ice, clearly not natural formations. The pilot circled twice, looking for a safe landing zone. The terrain was treacherous, but there was a relatively flat area about 200 yards from the exposure site where they could set down without excessive risk. As soon as the helicopter touched ground, Marcus and the team disembarked, moving carefully across the unstable snow. Up close, the exposed bodies were both more and less than Marcus had expected. The extreme cold and ice had preserved them remarkably well, but the avalanche had also caused significant damage, scattering remains across a wide area. He counted at least 4 distinct sets of remains visible from their current position, all wearing the bright synthetic jackets and gear that dated from the late 1990s. "Look at this," called out Rebecca Martinez, the team's lead recovery specialist. She was crouched near what appeared to be a partially exposed backpack, its fabric still vibrant despite nearly 3 decades in the ice. Marcus joined her, watching as she carefully brushed away snow to reveal a name written in faded marker on the pack's exterior. Jennifer Chen. Marcus pulled out his satellite phone and contacted the office. "We've got confirmation," he said when the dispatcher answered. "Multiple bodies, all consistent with the 1997 disappearances. We're going to need additional support and notification for the families." As the team began the careful process of documenting and recovering the remains, Marcus surveyed the area more carefully. Something about the scene bothered him, though he couldn't immediately articulate what. The bodies were scattered, yes, but their positioning seemed strange for avalanche victims. They weren't clustered together as he'd expect from a group caught in a sudden snowslide. Instead, they were spread out in a rough line, as if they had been moving in single file when whatever happened to them occurred. He walked slowly along the debris field, noting the locations where remains had been exposed. Rebecca and her team worked methodically, photographing everything before attempting any recovery. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks, and they had perhaps 3 more hours of good light to work with before they'd need to establish a temporary camp and resume operations in the morning. "Deputy, you need to see this," Rebecca called out, her voice carrying an edge that made Marcus immediately alert. He made his way to where she stood near the upper edge of the exposed ice field, staring down at something that made her face pale despite the cold-induced flush on her cheeks. What Marcus saw made his breath catch. Partially visible through a thin layer of ice was another body. But unlike the others, this one wasn't scattered or damaged by the avalanche. It was intact, perfectly preserved, and positioned in a way that sent chills down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The body lay face down with arms extended forward, fingers clawed into the ice as if the person had been trying desperately to climb or escape from something. But most disturbing was what surrounded the body. Carved into the ice in rough, desperate scratches were words, barely legible but unmistakable once Marcus's eyes adjusted to read them. "Don't go down," the message read. "They're waiting." Sarah Chen received the call while sorting through old case files in her home office, a converted bedroom that had become a shrine to her sister's disappearance. Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Holland introduced himself with the careful courtesy of someone delivering news that would change everything. When he told her they'd found remains on Frozen Ridge, remains that included a backpack bearing Jennifer's name, Sarah felt the room tilt sideways. She gripped the edge of her desk, forcing herself to breathe. 27 years of searching, of hoping and dreading in equal measure, and now this moment had finally arrived. Marcus was still talking, his voice gentle but professional, explaining about the avalanche, the recovery operation, the need for formal identification. Sarah heard the words without fully processing them, her mind stuck on a single thought. Jennifer had been there all along, frozen on the mountain while Sarah had walked those trails year after year. "Mrs. Chen, are you still there?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Sarah managed, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "I'm here. When can I see her?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The remains will be transported to the county medical examiner's office in Denver. The recovery is ongoing and the conditions are difficult, but we expect to have everything down from the mountain within 48 hours. I understand this is incredibly difficult, but I need to ask if you'd be willing to come to Summit County to speak with us about your sister and the circumstances of the disappearance." "I'm already here," Sarah said. "I've been on the mountain for the past 3 days. I do this every year." Another pause, longer this time. You're here now? In Summit County? I'm staying at the Pineview Lodge, about 20 miles from the trailhead. I know every inch of that mountain, Deputy. I've been searching for my sister since the day she disappeared. Marcus's voice changed, becoming more focused. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to send a car to pick you up. There's something at the recovery site I think you need to see. Something that might help us understand what happened up there. Would you be willing to come up to the site? I should warn you, it's difficult terrain and the weather is deteriorating. Sarah was already reaching for her winter gear. I'll be ready when your car arrives. The drive to the helicopter staging area took 40 minutes through increasingly heavy snowfall. The deputy who picked her up, a young woman named Rodriguez, made small talk at first, but eventually fell silent, perhaps sensing that Sarah needed time to prepare herself for what was coming. Sarah stared out the window at the passing landscape, the familiar mountains that had dominated her life for so long now, holding answers she'd sought for decades. At the staging area, Marcus Holland met her personally. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps early 40s, with the weathered face of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. His eyes held a mixture of professional sympathy and something else, an uncertainty that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Mrs. Chen, thank you for coming, he said, shaking her hand firmly. Before we go up, I need to prepare you. The site is disturbing, not just because of your sister, but because of something we found. A message carved into the ice near one of the bodies. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What kind of message? Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph. Sarah stared at the words, scratched desperately, into the ice, her mind struggling to process their meaning. Don't go down. They're waiting. The handwriting was crude, carved with what must have been tremendous effort by someone in extreme distress. Do you have any idea what this might mean? Marcus asked gently. Sarah shook her head slowly, unable to tear her eyes from the photograph. Jennifer never mentioned anything about going down or anyone waiting. The plan was always to summit and return the same way they went up. Who else was with her when this was written? Was she alone? We don't know yet, Marcus admitted. The remains are scattered over a fairly wide area due to the avalanche, and we're still working on recovery and identification. But Mrs. Chen, there's something else you should know. We've only recovered 4 bodies so far, possibly 5. Your sister's group had 7 members. The helicopter ride to the recovery site was mercifully short, though the buffeting wind made the journey terrifying. Sarah had flown in helicopters before during her own search operations, but never in conditions this severe. When they finally touched down on the exposed ridge, she understood why the recovery operation was racing against time. The weather was clearly worsening, clouds rolling in that would soon make further flights impossible. Marcus helped her disembark, keeping a steadying hand on her arm as they crossed the treacherous terrain. The recovery team was still working, carefully extracting remains and equipment from the ice. Rebecca Martinez, the lead specialist, approached them with an evidence bag containing items recovered from Jennifer's backpack. We found these, Rebecca said quietly, showing Sarah the contents. A water-damaged journal, a camera with its film likely ruined by decades of freezing and thawing, and Jennifer's wallet with her driver's license still visible through the plastic window. Sarah took the bag with trembling hands, staring at her sister's face in the license photo. 23 years old, smiling at the camera with her whole life ahead of her. Sarah had been 35 when Jennifer disappeared, convinced that her younger sister would be found safe, that there had to be a reasonable explanation. Now, looking at these recovered items, the finality of it settled over her like the falling snow. The message in the ice, Sarah said, looking up at Marcus. Can you show me where it was found? He hesitated, clearly uncertain whether this was wise, but something in Sarah's expression must have convinced him. They walked carefully to the upper edge of the recovery site, where the ice wall rose dramatically. There, preserved in the frozen surface like some nightmarish hieroglyph, were the scratched words Sarah had seen in the photograph. She moved closer, studying the letters. The carving was rough, done with something sharp but not ideal for the purpose. Probably a knife, or perhaps a climbing tool. The letters were large, desperate, meant to be seen. But by whom? If the person who carved this message had been dying on this mountain, who did they expect would read it? "Mrs. Chen, do you recognize the handwriting?" Marcus asked. Sarah leaned in, her breath fogging the ice surface. The cold had preserved the message with cruel clarity, every scratch and gouge visible in the late afternoon light. She studied the formation of the letters, the way the T's were crossed, the particular slant of the script. Her heart sank as recognition dawned. "It's Jennifer's handwriting," she whispered. "My sister wrote this." Marcus exchanged a glance with Rebecca, who had joined them. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely certain," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength despite the tears now freezing on her cheeks. She had a very distinctive way of writing, especially her capital D's and W's. This is definitely her handwriting. But what does it mean? Don't go down, they're waiting. Who was waiting? And why would going down be dangerous? Before anyone could respond, one of the recovery team members called out urgently from farther down the slope. "We've got another one, and this one's different." The group moved carefully to where the team member stood, pointing at something partially exposed in a crevasse that the avalanche had opened in the ice. Sarah saw it immediately, another body, but this one hadn't been with the hikers' group. The clothing was wrong, older, the style dating from perhaps the 1970s or even earlier. The fabric had deteriorated more severely than the hikers' modern synthetic gear, but enough remained to see that this person had also died on the mountain, decades before Jennifer's group had even arrived. "How many people have died on this mountain?" Rebecca asked quietly, though the question seemed directed more at the mountain itself than any specific person. Marcus was already on his radio, calling for additional support and notification to the medical examiner about the expanded scope of the recovery operation. Sarah stood at the edge of the crevasse, staring down at the unknown victim, her mind racing with terrible new possibilities. Jennifer's message suddenly took on a different meaning. Not a warning about descending the mountain in the normal sense, but something else entirely. Something about what lay beneath the ice, waiting in the depths of this frozen peak that had claimed far more lives than anyone had previously known. The wind picked up sharply, carrying with it the first heavy flakes of the incoming storm. Marcus touched Sarah's arm, his voice urgent. "We need to evacuate now. This weather is going to shut us down completely within the hour." As they hurried back toward the helicopter, Sarah cast one final look at the recovery site. In the failing light and swirling snow, the scattered remains of the 1997 hikers seemed to form a pattern, a trail of bodies leading not up toward the summit, but down into the darker depths of the mountain. Jennifer's warning echoed in Sarah's mind, intertwining with a growing dread that the discovery of these bodies wasn't an ending at all, but the beginning of something far worse. The helicopter lifted off just as visibility dropped to nearly zero, leaving behind the recovery team to secure the site as best they could before the storm made further work impossible. As they descended toward the valley, Sarah clutched the evidence bag containing Jennifer's belongings. Her sister's final message burned into her memory alongside a terrible question. If Jennifer was warning them not to go down, what had she seen in those final moments that terrified her enough to carve those desperate words into the ice? The storm that swept through Summit County that night was the worst in 15 years, dropping nearly 3 feet of snow and making any return to the recovery site impossible for at least 72 hours. Sarah spent the evening in a conference room at the sheriff's office, working with Marcus and a team of investigators to piece together everything known about the 1997 disappearance. The original case files filled 2 large boxes, thousands of pages of witness statements, search reports, and investigative notes that had led nowhere. Sarah had reviewed much of this material before through Freedom of Information requests, but seeing it all laid out in official form brought new details into focus. The 7 hikers had met through an outdoor adventure club based in Denver, coming together specifically for the Christmas Day summit attempt. Besides Jennifer, there had been Michael Torres, the group leader with extensive mountaineering experience, Amanda Vickers, and her boyfriend James Hewitt, both geology students, Robert Chen, no relation to Jennifer despite the shared surname, Lisa Park, a photography enthusiast who had documented several previous climbs, and finally, David Brennan, the youngest at 21, on his first major winter ascent. The last confirmed sighting was Christmas morning at 6:45, Marcus said, pointing to a statement from a forest ranger who had seen the group beginning their ascent. They were properly equipped, moving at a good pace. Weather conditions were optimal. By all accounts, it should have been a routine climb. Sarah studied the topographical maps spread across the table, marked with the group's planned route and the subsequent search patterns. The original search focused on avalanche scenarios and the possibility they'd fallen into a crevasse. But if Jennifer's warning was about something waiting below, that suggests they encountered something or someone else on the mountain. "We need to consider all possibilities," said Detective Angela Morrison, who had driven up from Denver to consult on the case. She was in her 50s, with sharp eyes that had seen their share of tragedy. "But Mrs. Chen, I have to ask, is it possible your sister was disoriented from hypothermia when she carved that message? Confusion and paranoia are common symptoms of severe cold exposure." Sarah had considered this, of course. She'd spent years studying hypothermia, avalanche psychology, and every other factor that might explain what happened to Jennifer. "It's possible," she admitted. "But Jennifer was an experienced hiker. She'd done winter climbs before, knew the signs of hypothermia, and the message was too deliberate, too carefully placed. She wanted someone to find it and understand." Marcus pulled up a file on his laptop, turning the screen so Sarah could see. "I've been going through historical records of incidents on Frozen Ridge. The mountain has a reputation locally, though most of it gets dismissed as folklore. But there have been other disappearances over the years, not as publicized as your sister's case." The screen showed a timeline stretching back to 1952. Sarah leaned forward, reading the entries with growing unease. In 1952, 2 hunters had vanished near the eastern face of the mountain, their camp found abandoned with their rifles still inside. In 1963, a solo climber named Martin Hayes had disappeared, his body never recovered. In 1978, a group of 3 experienced mountaineers had gone missing, though one of them, a woman named Catherine Walsh, had been found alive 4 days later suffering from severe exposure and trauma-induced amnesia with no memory of what happened to her companions. "Did anyone interview this Catherine Walsh woman recently?" Sarah asked. Marcus nodded. "I called her this afternoon. She's 73 now, living in Boulder. She still can't remember what happened during those 4 days, but she said she's had nightmares about it her whole life. Dreams of going down into darkness, of voices calling to her from beneath the ice." The room fell silent. Angela Morrison broke it first, her voice carefully neutral. "That could be psychological trauma manifesting symbolically, the mind creating false memories to explain gaps." "Or it could be something real," Sarah countered, "something that multiple people encountered on that mountain over decades." Before the discussion could continue, Marcus's phone rang. He answered, his expression growing increasingly tense as he listened. "Understood. Keep the area secured and don't let anyone approach until we can get back up there." He ended the call and looked at the others. That was the recovery team. They managed to reach the site briefly during a weather window. They found 3 more bodies, bringing the total to 7. Sarah felt relief flood through her, immediately followed by guilt. 7 bodies meant all of Jennifer's group had been accounted for, but it also meant 7 families would be getting the news she'd just received. Were they able to make any identifications? Not yet, but they documented everything photographically. The medical examiner will handle formal identification once the remains are brought down. Marcus paused, his face troubled. But there's something else. When they expanded the search area around the crevasse where we found that older victim, they discovered it's not just a crevasse. It's an opening, a cave entrance that was hidden under the ice. The avalanche exposed it. Sarah stood up, moving closer to the topographical maps. "Show me exactly where." Marcus marked the location on the map. It was several hundred yards below where the hikers' bodies had been found, in an area of the mountain that search teams in 1997 had covered, but clearly not thoroughly enough. The terrain was treacherous there, a maze of ice formations and unstable snowpack that made detailed searching dangerous. "Could the hikers have taken shelter in this cave?" Angela asked. "Maybe they were trying to escape deteriorating weather?" "The weather was perfect that Christmas day," Sarah reminded her. "Clear skies, minimal wind. The conditions didn't turn bad until the following evening, long after they should have returned." She turned to Marcus. "I need to go into that cave, as soon as the weather allows." "Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, this is now an active investigation into 7 deaths. We can't allow civilians into what might be a crime scene." "I'm not just any civilian," Sarah said firmly. "I'm an experienced mountaineer who knows this terrain better than anyone on your team. I've spent 27 years studying every inch of frozen ridge. If there's something in that cave that explains what happened to my sister, I'm going to see it." Marcus and Angela exchanged glances. Finally, Angela spoke. "If you're going in, you go with a full team, and you follow all safety protocols. Agreed?" Sarah nodded, though her mind was already racing ahead to what they might find. The cave entrance exposed after nearly 3 decades of being hidden beneath ice and snow. Jennifer's warning about not going down, about something waiting. The pattern of bodies spread out as if the hikers had been fleeing from something rather than succumbing to natural causes. The conference room door opened and a young officer entered, carrying a laptop. "Deputy Holland, we just received something you need to see. The lab managed to recover data from one of the cameras found at the site. Most of the film was destroyed, but they pulled off a few digital photos that were stored in the camera's memory card." Marcus took the laptop, pulling up the recovered images. There were only 5 photos, all dated December 25th, 1997. The first 3 showed the hiking group at various points during their ascent, smiling and enthusiastic. Jennifer was visible in 2 of them, bundled in her bright blue jacket, her expression radiating joy. The 4th photograph showed the view from near the summit, the vast expanse of the Rockies stretching in all directions under clear blue skies. But the 5th photograph made everyone in the room go still. It showed the group gathered around something on the ground, their expressions no longer joyful but concerned, almost frightened. The image quality was poor, damaged by time and moisture, but Sarah could make out what they were looking at. An opening in the ice, dark and uninviting, with what appeared to be old climbing rope visible at its edge. "They found the cave," Sarah whispered. "On Christmas Day, during their climb, they found it and went inside." Marcus zoomed in on the photograph, studying the details. "Look at the timestamp. This was taken at 2:15 in the afternoon. They should have been descending by then if they wanted to make it back before dark. But they stopped to investigate this cave." "Curiosity," Angela said. "Or maybe they saw something that concerned them. Old climbing equipment could indicate someone had been there before, possibly someone in distress. Sarah thought of the older body they'd found, the one dressed in clothing from decades earlier. Had Jennifer's group discovered remains in that cave? Had they gone inside to investigate and encountered something that led to their deaths? The rest of the evening was spent cataloging every piece of information they had, building timelines, and coordinating with the medical examiner's office about the identification process. By the time Sarah returned to her lodge room after midnight, her mind was churning with questions and terrible possibilities. She lay in bed, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, thinking about Jennifer's last hours. Her sister had always been the brave one, the first to explore unknown trails, the one who saw adventure where others saw risk. That Christmas day, she had found something on Frozen Ridge that changed her from adventurous to terrified, something that made her carve a desperate warning into ice with her dying strength. The storm continued outside, wind howling around the lodge with a sound that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of voices calling from far away. She pulled the blankets tighter and closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself thinking about Catherine Walsh, the woman who had survived her encounter with the mountain, but lost her memory and her companions. Sarah made a mental note to contact her tomorrow, regardless of what the official investigation decided. If Catherine had nightmares about voices beneath the ice, about going down into darkness, then she might be the only person alive who could prepare Sarah for what waited in that cave. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the mountain under fresh layers of white, sealing the secrets beneath the ice for a few more days. But Sarah knew with absolute certainty that when the weather cleared and they finally entered that cave, they would find answers. The question that kept her awake until dawn was whether those answers would bring closure or open doorways to horrors that should have remained frozen forever. The storm broke on the third day, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow and a crystalline sky that seemed to mock the dark discoveries buried beneath it. Sarah woke before dawn, already dressed in her climbing gear by the time Marcus called to confirm the cave expedition was scheduled for 10 that morning. The recovery team had spent the previous day securing the site and establishing safety protocols for entering the cave, which initial probing suggested extended deep into the mountain's interior. Catherine Walsh had agreed to meet Sarah for breakfast at a diner halfway between Boulder and Summit County. Sarah arrived early, ordering coffee she didn't drink while watching the door. When Catherine finally entered, Sarah recognized her immediately, despite the decades that had passed since the photographs in the case files. She was small and thin, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had learned caution the hard way. "Mrs. Chen," Catherine said, sliding into the booth across from Sarah. Her voice was soft, almost musical, but her eyes held shadows that never quite faded. "Thank you for being willing to meet with me." "I should be thanking you," Sarah replied. "I know this can't be easy, talking about what happened." Catherine ordered tea and sat silent for a moment, her hands wrapped around the warm cup as if drawing comfort from its heat. "I've spent 47 years trying to remember what happened on that mountain. Doctors tell me my mind is protecting me from trauma, that the memories might never return. But the dreams never stop, Mrs. Chen. Every night I go back there." "Tell me about the dreams," Sarah said gently. Catherine's gaze grew distant. "They start the same way each time. I'm climbing with Tom and Richard, my companions from 1978. We're looking for something, though I can never quite remember what. Then we find an opening in the ice, a cave entrance we didn't expect. Tom wants to keep climbing, but Richard is curious. He's always been the explorer, the one who can't resist a mystery." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "In the dream, we go inside. The cave is deeper than it seems, tunnels extending down into the mountain. And there are voices, Mrs. Chen. voices calling to us from below, promising things. What kind of things? Warmth, Catherine whispered. Safety. Everything we needed in that moment. The voices knew exactly what to say to make us keep descending. But there was something wrong about them, something that made my skin crawl even as I felt drawn to follow them deeper. She looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes directly. In my dream, I realized the voices are coming from people, but not living people. Not anymore. And I run. I run back toward the surface while Tom and Richard keep going down, following the voices that promise them salvation. Sarah felt cold settle into her bones. When you were found, where exactly were you? Near the cave entrance, apparently. The search team said I was curled in a ball just outside the opening, suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration. I'd been missing for 4 days, but I have no conscious memory of any of it. My body was covered in scratches and bruises, like I'd been crawling through tight spaces. And my hands... Catherine held them up, showing faint scars across her palms and fingers. The doctor said it looked like I'd been clawing at ice, desperately trying to climb or dig my way out of something. Did they search the cave? Look for your companions? Catherine nodded slowly. They tried, but the cave system was unstable, and they were worried about triggering a collapse. After 3 days of limited searching, they called it off. Tom and Richard were declared dead, victims of the mountain. I was the lucky one who survived, though I've never felt particularly lucky. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Catherine the photograph of Jennifer's warning carved into the ice. My sister wrote this before she died. Don't go down. They're waiting. Does this mean anything to you? Catherine stared at the image for a long moment, her face growing pale. That's what I dream about, she said finally, going down into the dark and them waiting. But Mrs. Chen, here's what terrifies me most about those dreams. I don't think they're just dreams. I think they're memories trying to surface, and my conscious mind won't let them through because what I saw down there, what's waiting in the deep places of that mountain, it's something human beings aren't meant to know about. They talked for another hour, Catherine sharing details of her dreams that had remained consistent over decades. The sense of descending through ice tunnels that seemed to pulse with their own dim light. The voices that spoke in multiple tones simultaneously, creating harmonies that were beautiful and horrible at once. The feeling of being watched by something ancient and patient, something that had been waiting in the mountain for far longer than human beings had been climbing it. By the time Sarah arrived at the staging area for the cave expedition, she felt weighted down by more than just her climbing gear. Marcus and his team were ready, along with 2 experienced cave rescue specialists and a geologist named Dr. Raymond Park, who specialized in ice cave formations. Sarah was introduced to everyone and briefed on safety protocols that she already knew by heart. The helicopter ride to the site felt shorter than before, perhaps because Sarah's mind was occupied with Catherine's warnings. When they landed and made their way to the cave entrance, Sarah saw that the recovery team had done extensive work to stabilize the opening and ensure it wouldn't collapse on anyone entering. Portable lights had been set up, illuminating the first 20 feet of the cave's interior and revealing smooth ice walls that reflected the light in strange prismatic patterns. Dr. Park examined the cave entrance with professional interest. "This is remarkable," he said, running a gloved hand along the ice. "This formation has been here for centuries, possibly longer. The ice has unusual properties, almost crystalline in structure. I've never seen anything quite like it." "Is it safe to enter?" Marcus asked. "As safe as any ice cave can be," Dr. Park replied. "We'll need to move carefully and test each section before proceeding, but the structure appears stable." The team entered in pairs. Sarah partnered with Marcus while the specialists worked ahead of them, securing ropes and testing the floor. The cave descended at a gentle angle at first, the passage wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The temperature inside was noticeably colder than outside, the air still and heavy with a quality that made Sarah's breathing feel labored. 30 feet in, they found the first artifact. It was a climbing rope, old and partially deteriorated, tied to a piton that someone had driven into the ice decades ago. Dr. Park examined it carefully. This is from the 1970s, maybe earlier. Someone anchored themselves here for a descent. They continued deeper, the passage narrowing slightly and the angle of descent increasing. At 50 feet, they found more evidence of previous explorers. A broken lantern, a torn piece of clothing frozen into the ice wall, and most disturbing scratch marks in the ice, similar to those Catherine had described on her hands. "Someone was trying to climb back out," one of the rescue specialists observed. "Look at the angle and depth of these gouges. This person was desperate." The cave continued downward, branching occasionally into smaller passages that the team marked but didn't explore. They were following the main tunnel, which showed the most evidence of previous human presence. At 100 feet below the surface, they found something that made everyone stop. It was a camping setup, ancient and preserved in the ice. A small tent, collapsed but still recognizable, surrounded by personal items that had frozen solid over decades. Sarah watched as Dr. Park carefully documented everything before they began the process of examination. Inside the tent were 2 sleeping bags, both occupied. The bodies inside were remarkably preserved by the extreme cold. 2 men who appeared to be in their 30s, dressed in climbing gear from the 1960s or early 1970s. Their faces were peaceful, almost serene, but their hands told a different story. Like the scratch marks they'd seen earlier, these men's fingers were torn and bloody, frozen in positions that suggested they'd been clawing at something in their final moments. "Why would they set up camp this deep inside a cave?" Marcus asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Sarah noticed something clutched in one of the men's hands, a small notebook protected by a waterproof pouch. She pointed it out to Dr. Park, who carefully extracted it and opened the pouch. The notebook was remarkably well preserved, filled with handwritten entries in neat script. Dr. Park read aloud, "November 15th, 1968. We found something incredible in this cave, something that defies explanation. The voices led us here, promising warmth and shelter from the storm. But Harold is concerned. He says the voices aren't right, that they're telling us things they shouldn't know. I think he's being paranoid. How could voices in a cave know about my daughter, about the accident that took her last year? But they do know. They speak of her with such kindness, such understanding. They say if we go deeper, we can find peace. We can let go of the pain." The entry ended there. Dr. Park flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank. Whatever had happened to these men occurred before they could write anything else. "We need to continue," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Jennifer and her group came down here. If we're going to understand what happened to them, we need to see what they saw." Marcus looked uncertain. "Mrs. Chen, this is getting dangerous. We've found historical victims, which is valuable for the investigation, but pushing deeper into unknown cave systems is exactly what my sister did," Sarah interrupted, "and I need to know why. I need to understand what could have been compelling enough to make 7 experienced hikers abandon safety and descend into this place." After brief discussion, the team agreed to continue, but with enhanced caution. They descended another 50 feet, the passage growing narrower and the ice taking on that strange crystalline quality Dr. Park had noted at the entrance, but more pronounced. The walls seemed to glow faintly with their own light, a phenomenon Dr. Park couldn't immediately explain. At 200 feet below the surface, they found what they'd been looking for, and dreading. The passage opened into a larger chamber, perhaps 30 feet across, and scattered throughout it were the personal belongings of Jennifer's hiking group. Backpacks, climbing equipment, cameras, all abandoned in various states. But no bodies. Sarah moved through the chamber carefully, identifying items she recognized from the original investigation reports. Michael Torres's distinctive red pack, Amanda Vickers's camera bag, with her name embroidered on the side, and there, near the far wall, Jennifer's journal, the twin to the one that had been recovered with her body on the surface. Sarah picked it up with trembling hands, opening to the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written in distress, but unmistakably Jennifer's. December 25th, 1997, approximately 8 p.m. We made a terrible mistake coming down here. The voices promised us shelter, knowledge, understanding. They knew things about each of us, personal things no one else could know. We thought it was some acoustic phenomenon, some natural occurrence. But it's not natural. There's something down here, something old and patient and hungry. It feeds on us somehow, not our bodies, but something deeper. Lisa went further down 2 hours ago and hasn't come back. We can hear her voice calling to us, but it's not her anymore. The voice sounds like Lisa, uses her words, but there's something else, underneath it, something that makes my skin crawl. We're trying to climb back out, but we're so tired. The cold is getting worse, not better like the voices promised. Michael says we need to keep moving, keep climbing, but part of me wants to go deeper, wants to hear what the voices will tell me next. That's the worst part. Even knowing what this place is doing to us, I want to stay. I want to listen. If anyone finds this, don't come down. Don't listen to the voices. They're waiting in the deep places, and they've been waiting for a very long time. The journal entry ended there. Sarah looked up to find Marcus and the others staring at her, having read over her shoulder. "We need to leave," Marcus said firmly. "Now." But before anyone could move, they heard it. A voice, soft and feminine, echoing from deeper in the cave system. It spoke with perfect clarity despite the distance, and what it said made Sarah's blood turn to ice. "Sarah," the voice called, and it sounded exactly like Jennifer. "Sarah, I've been waiting for you. Come down. Come see what I've found. It's beautiful down here, Sarah. It's everything we've been looking for." Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm as she took an involuntary step toward the passage from which the voice had emanated. "That's not your sister," he said firmly, though his own face had gone pale. "Your sister is dead. We recovered her body on the surface." Sarah knew he was right. Intellectually, she understood that Jennifer had died 27 years ago, that her remains were currently in the county medical examiner's office, awaiting formal identification. But the voice was perfect, capturing every nuance of Jennifer's speech patterns, the slight upturn at the end of her sentences, the warm tone she used when addressing her older sister. "Sarah, please," the voice called again, now with a note of sadness. "I've been alone down here for so long. Don't you want to see me again? Don't you want to understand?" Dr. Park was frantically checking equipment, his scientific mind trying to find a rational explanation. "It could be some kind of acoustic phenomenon," he said, though he sounded unconvinced. "Ice caves can create unusual sound properties, echoes that might seem like voices." "That's not an echo," one of the cave rescue specialists said quietly. "That's something else entirely." The voice came again, but this time it wasn't alone. Other voices joined it, creating a chorus that filled the chamber with overlapping sounds. Sarah recognized some of them from the case files. Michael Torres's deep baritone, Amanda Vickers's slight southern accent, Lisa Park's musical lilt. They were all calling now, all inviting the team to come deeper, to see what they'd discovered, to understand the beauty waiting in the depths. "We're leaving," Marcus ordered, his voice cutting through the chorus. "Everyone back to the surface now." The team began moving toward the passage that led upward, but Sarah found herself rooted in place. The voices were so compelling, so perfectly calibrated to appeal to everything she'd spent 27 years seeking. Answers, understanding, reunion with her lost sister. Part of her mind screamed that this was wrong, that she needed to flee, but another part whispered that if she just went a little deeper, just listened a little more, she would finally have the closure she'd been desperately pursuing. "Mrs. Chen!" Marcus was pulling at her arm, his grip firm enough to leave bruises. "Whatever's down there, it's not your sister. It's using her voice, her memory, to trap you just like it trapped them." The words penetrated Sarah's fog, breaking the spell enough for her to take a step backward. Then another. The voices grew louder, more insistent, overlapping in ways that created unsettling harmonies. And underneath them all, Sarah heard something else, a sound that was definitely not human, a low resonance that made her bones ache and her teeth hurt. The team retreated up the passage, moving as quickly as safety allowed. Behind them, the voices followed, calling names, making promises, saying things that should have been impossible for anyone to know. Personal details, private memories, secrets that had been buried with the dead. Sarah tried not to listen, focusing instead on the climb, on putting distance between herself and whatever waited in the depths. They were 50 feet from the chamber when the temperature dropped dramatically. The already frigid air became brutally cold, cold enough that Sarah's breath froze instantly, creating ice crystals that hung in the beam of her headlamp. The ice walls around them began to make cracking sounds, stress fractures appearing in the crystalline surface. "Move faster!" one of the rescue specialists shouted. "The cave structure is destabilizing." They scrambled upward, abandoning careful procedure for desperate speed. Behind them, the cracking sounds intensified, accompanied by a deep groaning that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Sarah risked a glance backward and immediately wished she hadn't. The passage behind them was collapsing, ice and rock falling inward as if something was pulling the tunnel closed, sealing off the depths. The team burst out of the cave entrance just as a massive section of the passage they'd been in collapsed completely. They scrambled away from the opening, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the unstable entrance. For several minutes, they could do nothing but breathe heavily, recovering from the exertion and the terror. When Sarah finally caught her breath and looked back at the cave entrance, she saw that it had partially collapsed, though not completely. The opening was smaller now, choked with ice and debris, but still accessible to someone determined enough to enter. And standing just inside that opening, barely visible in the shadows, were figures. They stood motionless, watching the team with expressions that Sarah couldn't quite make out from this distance. "Do you see them?" she asked Marcus, pointing toward the entrance. Marcus followed her gaze, his body tensing. "I see them. Team, how many individuals at the cave entrance?" The responses varied. Some saw 7 figures, others saw more. A few claimed to see nothing at all but shadows and ice formations. But Sarah could see them clearly now. 7 people standing just inside the cave mouth, wearing the bright synthetic jackets of 1990s hiking gear. Jennifer stood in the center, her face pale but smiling, raising one hand in a gesture that could have been either a wave or a warning. "We need to seal this cave," Dr. Park said, his voice shaking. "Permanently. Whatever's down there, it's not natural. It's not anything that should exist." "We can't seal it until we understand what it is," Sarah argued, even as she shuddered at the memory of those voices. "There might be more victims down there, more people who came to this mountain and never left." And there will be more if we leave this entrance accessible, Marcus countered. Mrs. Chen, I understand your need for answers, but we just witnessed something that defies explanation. We heard voices of people we know are dead. The cave structure responded to our presence like it was alive. Whatever scientific curiosity we might have, it's outweighed by the danger. The debate was interrupted by a call on Marcus's radio. The recovery team working on the surface had found something during the final body recovery, something they needed the cave team to see immediately. With a final glance at the cave entrance where the figures had now vanished, the team made their way to where the last of the 1997 hikers' bodies had been found. What they discovered there made the entire situation even more confusing and terrifying. The seventh body, identified through personal items as David Brennan, the youngest member of the hiking group, had been found in a completely different location from the others. While the other 6 had been scattered in that line formation Sarah had noticed initially, all within 100 yards of each other, David's body was nearly a quarter-mile away, positioned as if he'd been running. More disturbing were the items found with him: a climbing rope tied around his waist that extended back toward the cave entrance, and clutched in his frozen hand was a piece of paper protected by a plastic bag with a message scrawled in desperate handwriting. Marcus read it aloud. I got out. Managed to break free from the voices long enough to climb. But I can feel them pulling at me, calling me back. The rope is my anchor, my way of remembering which direction is real. Jennifer and the others, they went too deep. They listened too long. The things down there, they're not ghosts or echoes. They're something older, something that was here before the mountain was formed. They feed on consciousness, on human awareness. Every person who dies near them becomes part of them, another voice, in the chorus, another lure for the next victim. I can hear Jennifer calling to me now, begging me to come back, promising me understanding. But it's not her. It's using her, wearing her like a mask. If I don't make it, if the cold takes me or I give in and go back down, seal the cave. Collapse the mountain if you have to. Don't let anyone else hear the voices. The message was dated December 26th, 1997, the day after the group had entered the cave. David Brennan had survived at least a full day longer than his companions, fighting against whatever lived in the depths while the cold slowly claimed him. Dr. Park was documenting everything with shaking hands, his scientific worldview clearly struggling to accommodate what they'd experienced. We need to notify the authorities, he said, not just local law enforcement, but federal agencies. If there's something in that mountain that poses a threat to human life, it needs to be properly contained. Contained how? One of the rescue specialists asked. You can't arrest or quarantine whatever that is. And if we publicize this, every thrill seeker and paranormal investigator in the country will descend on this location. Sarah listened to the debate while staring at David Brennan's final message. He'd tried so hard to escape, to warn others, to prevent future tragedies. But his warning had been buried under ice and snow for 27 years, discovered too late to save anyone. How many others were down there? How many people had the mountain claimed over the decades or centuries, all of them becoming part of the chorus that lured the next victims deeper? We need to talk to Catherine Walsh again, Sarah said suddenly. She escaped this same phenomenon in 1978. She might have information that could help us understand what we're dealing with. Marcus nodded slowly. Agreed. But first we need to get off this mountain and debrief with the full investigative team. Whatever we decide to do about that cave, it needs to be carefully planned. The helicopter evacuation took another hour, with multiple trips required to extract all personnel and evidence from the site. Sarah took the last flight out, unable to tear her eyes from the cave entrance until the helicopter lifted off, and distance made it impossible to see clearly. Even then, she could have sworn she saw figures standing near the opening, watching the helicopter's departure with patient, knowing expressions. Back at the sheriff's office, the team spent hours going through everything they'd found and experienced. The medical examiner confirmed that all 7 members of the 1997 hiking group had been accounted for, along with the 2 historical victims from the 1960s. Cause of death in all cases appeared to be hypothermia, though the medical examiner noted unusual cellular damage that he couldn't immediately explain, almost as if the victims' bodies had been subjected to some form of energy drain beyond simple cold exposure. As evening fell, Sarah sat in the conference room alone, surrounded by case files and evidence bags, trying to make sense of everything. Her phone rang, Catherine Walsh's name appearing on the screen. "Mrs. Chen," Catherine said without preamble when Sarah answered. "I've been having the dreams again, stronger than ever since we talked this morning. But this time, there's something new. I remember what Tom said to me right before I ran. He told me the voices were beautiful because they were true. That whatever was down there, it understood us completely, knew every fear and hope and desire. And that's why it was so dangerous, because it could give us everything we wanted except the one thing we needed most." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "The strength to walk away," Catherine replied. "Mrs. Chen, did you find the cave? Did you go inside?" "Yes," Sarah said quietly. "We found it, and we heard the voices, including my sister's." There was a long silence on the other end. "Then you understand," Catherine said finally. "You understand why I can't remember. My mind is protecting me from the knowledge that I wanted to stay. That part of me is still down there, will always be down there. Listening to those voices promise me things I've spent a lifetime trying to forget I ever wanted." After the call ended, Sarah sat in the darkening room, thinking about Catherine's words. The voices didn't lie, exactly. They offered real understanding, genuine connection, a perfect reflection of everything a person desired. That's what made them so dangerous. They knew you completely because they'd consumed hundreds or thousands of people before you, collecting experiences and personalities and memories to use as lures. Jennifer's voice had known exactly what to say to Sarah, because it had access to everything Jennifer had ever known, every memory of their childhood together, every shared secret and inside joke. But it wasn't Jennifer. It was something ancient and hungry, wearing Jennifer's voice like a costume, using her sister's identity to draw Sarah down into the depths where she would join the chorus and help lure the next victim. The question that haunted Sarah as she finally left the office and returned to her lodge was whether they could really seal the cave, really prevent future tragedies. The mountain had claimed victims for at least 70 years, probably much longer. Freezing Ridge had earned its name and its dark reputation for a reason. And now that reputation would only grow, attracting the curious and the reckless despite any warnings. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Federal investigators coming. Bring everything you have on historical disappearances in the area." Sarah responded with a simple acknowledgement, then lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind outside. Somewhere in that wind, if she listened carefully enough, she could almost hear voices. Calling, promising, waiting with infinite patience for someone to listen long, enough to be drawn back to the mountain. The federal investigators arrived in the form of Dr. Elena Vasquez from the U.S. Geological Survey and Special Agent Robert Kim from the FBI's Unusual Phenomena Unit, a division Sarah hadn't known existed. They spent the morning reviewing all the evidence, listening to the team's accounts with expressions that suggested they'd encountered similar situations before, though they offered no details. "The cave needs to be permanently sealed," Dr. Vasquez said, after reviewing Dr. Park's geological surveys. "But not just blocked. We need to induce a controlled collapse of the entire upper tunnel system, making it impossible for anyone to access the deeper sections." "You're talking about destroying potential evidence," Sarah protested. "There could be dozens of victims down there, families who deserve to know what happened to their loved ones." Agent Kim shook his head. "Mrs. Chen, I understand your perspective, but my unit has dealt with similar phenomena in remote locations around the world. What you encountered in that cave is something we classify as a persistent psychological hazard. The exact nature is still being studied, but what we know is that certain geographic features, usually in isolated areas with specific geological properties, can generate effects that severely impact human consciousness and behavior." "You're saying this is natural?" Marcus asked skeptically. "We're saying we don't fully understand it," Dr. Vasquez replied. "The crystalline ice structure Dr. Park documented has properties we've seen in other locations. It seems to interact with electromagnetic fields in ways that might affect human brain activity. Combined with the acoustic properties of the cave system, extreme cold affecting judgment, and the psychological impact of isolation, you get a perfect storm of conditions that can produce the effects you experienced." Sarah wanted to argue, to insist that what they'd encountered was more than just geology and psychology, but she could see the determination in the federal investigators' eyes. They had a protocol for situations like this, and they were going to follow it regardless of objections. "What about the bodies we found?" she asked. "The historical victims?" "We'll recover everything accessible from the upper sections before the collapse," Agent Kim assured her. "But the deeper sections, where the primary hazard exists, those will be permanently sealed. No further expeditions will be authorized." The meeting continued for hours, planning the technical details of the cave collapse and discussing how to handle public information about the case. The official story would focus on the recovery of the 1997 hiking group, attributing their deaths to a combination of factors, including getting lost in the cave system, hypothermia, and poor decision-making. The voices, the strange phenomena, the psychological effects, all of that would be classified and restricted. Sarah listened to these plans with growing frustration. 7 families were about to receive closure about their missing loved ones, but it would be incomplete closure, sanitized of the truth about what their family members had actually encountered. David Brennan's desperate warning would be filed away in a classified database, his courage in trying to escape and alert others reduced to a footnote in a restricted report. After the meeting, Sarah found herself drawn back to the evidence table where Jennifer's recovered journal lay in its protective plastic bag. She picked it up, reading her sister's final entry again. The warning about not coming down, about the voices that knew too much and promised everything while delivering only death. "Your sister was brave," Agent Kim said quietly, approaching the table. She recognized what she was dealing with and tried to warn others, even while she was dying. "Will anyone ever know that?" Sarah asked bitterly. "Or will her warning just disappear into your classified files?" Kim was silent for a moment. "There's a balance we have to maintain, Mrs. Chen. If we publicize what's really in that cave, people will come. Not to be warned away, but because human beings are fundamentally curious about the unknown. For every person who reads the warning and stays away, there will be 3 who see it as a challenge or an opportunity. We've learned from experience that certain knowledge needs to be restricted for public safety." Sarah wanted to argue, but she thought about Catherine Walsh's words about wanting to stay, about the part of her that would always be in that cave. Kim was right. Even knowing the danger, even having experienced it firsthand, Sarah felt a pull to return, to hear Jennifer's voice one more time, to go just a little deeper and understand fully what her sister had encountered. "When will you collapse the cave?" she asked. 3 days, Kim replied. "We need time to set up properly and ensure the collapse is thorough enough to prevent any future access." Sarah spent those 3 days at the lodge, sorting through her own records of the case. 27 years of notes and maps and theories that were now being replaced by official truth. On the final evening before the collapse was scheduled, she made a decision. She drove to the base of Frozen Ridge just after midnight, parking in a turnout that gave her a clear view of the mountain's eastern face. She'd brought binoculars and a thermos of coffee, planning to keep vigil through the night. This would be her last time seeing the mountain as it had existed since Jennifer's disappearance, the last night before the cave was permanently sealed. Around 3 a.m, she saw lights on the mountain. At first, she assumed it was the federal team doing final preparations, but the lights were too high up, too close to the cave entrance. Sarah raised her binoculars and felt her breath catch. There were people at the cave entrance, at least a dozen figures visible in the moonlight. They stood in a loose semicircle around the partially collapsed opening, motionless and watching. Sarah knew with absolute certainty that these weren't members of the investigation team. She grabbed her phone to call Marcus, but before she could dial, movement caught her attention. One of the figures had turned to face her direction, though there was no way they could see her car from that distance in the darkness. Yet the figure raised one hand in a gesture that was unmistakably a wave, the same gesture Jennifer had made 3 days earlier. Sarah's hand trembled as she lowered the phone. The figure continued to wave slowly, patiently, as if they had all the time in the world to wait for a response. Around them, the other figures remained still, a silent audience to this strange communication across the distance. When Sarah finally looked away, breaking eye contact with the distant figure, she found that nearly an hour had passed. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, dawn approaching. When she looked back at the cave entrance, the figures were gone. The controlled collapse occurred at precisely 10 a.m, witnessed by a small group of officials and investigators but closed to the public. Sarah watched from the designated observation point as carefully placed charges detonated in sequence, sending massive sections of ice and rock tumbling down to fill the cave system. The operation took less than 5 minutes, but when it was finished, the entrance had been completely obliterated, buried under thousands of tons of debris. Dr. Vasquez confirmed through seismic monitoring that the collapse had extended deep into the mountain, closing off the upper tunnel system entirely. "No one will be accessing those depths again," she said with satisfaction. "The mountain has taken back its secrets." But as Sarah watched the settling dust and the crews beginning their cleanup, she wondered if that was really true. The cave might be sealed, but the mountain remained. And somewhere in its frozen depths, beneath all that ice and rock, something waited with the patience of ages. The voices might be silenced for now, trapped behind tons of stone, but Sarah suspected they would wait. They had waited before, through decades and probably centuries. They would wait again, until the mountain shifted, until the ice melted, until some future expedition found a new way into the depths. That evening, Sarah visited Catherine Walsh one final time before returning to her home. They sat in Catherine's comfortable living room, two women connected by their encounters with something that defied rational explanation. "It's over," Sarah said, though the words felt hollow. "The cave is sealed. Jennifer and the others can finally rest." Catherine studied her with knowing eyes. "Is it over for you, though? Can you walk away from the mountain now?" Sarah thought about the question carefully. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me feels like I should stay, should keep watching the mountain to make sure no one else gets hurt. But another part knows that's just an excuse, a reason to stay close to where I last heard Jennifer's voice." "Go home," Catherine said gently. "Return to your life. Honor your sister by living, not by haunting the place where she died. That's the hardest lesson I've learned in 47 years. The mountain will take everything you give it and ask for more. You have to be the one who chooses to walk away. Sarah left Boulder that night, driving through darkness toward her home in California. In her rearview mirror, the Rocky Mountains gradually shrank to distant peaks on the horizon, then disappeared entirely. She didn't look back. 5 years later, Sarah Chen stood in a university lecture hall, addressing a room full of students interested in cold case investigations and forensic psychology. The official story of the Frozen Ridge disappearances had been made public, sanitized of the elements that would have raised uncomfortable questions. 7 hikers lost in a cave system during a Christmas Day climb in 1997. Their remains finally recovered after an avalanche exposed the site 27 years later. Sarah had become an advocate for mountain safety, using her sister's story to educate people about the dangers of exploring unfamiliar terrain, of taking unnecessary risks, of failing to properly prepare for the unpredictable conditions of high-altitude environments. She never mentioned the voices, the psychological phenomena, the things that waited in the deep places. Those details remained classified, known only to a select group of investigators and the few survivors who had encountered them directly. But sometimes, late at night when she was alone, Sarah would think about what Agent Kim had told her during their final conversation. "The mountain isn't unique," he'd said. "There are places like this scattered around the world, geographic anomalies where human consciousness intersects with something we don't fully understand. Most stay hidden, undiscovered. A few become legendary for disappearances that authorities can never fully explain. The best we can do is identify them, restrict access when possible, and document what we learn for future reference." Sarah had asked him how many such places existed. Kim had given her a sad smile. "More than you'd think, fewer than you'd fear. The world is stranger than most people imagine, Mrs. Chen. Your sister found that out on Frozen Ridge. Others learn it in different places. The lucky ones, like you and Ms. Walsh, get to walk away and return to the normal world. But something always stays behind, doesn't it? A piece of yourself that never quite makes it back." He'd been right. Sarah had built a new life, had found purpose in her advocacy work, had even made peace with Jennifer's death in most ways. But there was a part of her that remained on that mountain, standing at the cave entrance, listening to her sister's voice, call from the depths. That part would never leave, would never stop wondering what might have happened if she'd taken just a few more steps down into the darkness. The lecture ended, and students approached with questions about forensic techniques, about how families cope with loss, about the investigative process that had finally solved the case. Sarah answered them all with practiced professionalism, sharing what she could while keeping the real secrets locked away. As the last students filed out, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Walsh. They'd stayed in touch over the years, an unlikely friendship forged in shared trauma. The message was brief. "Dreamed about the mountain last night. First time in months. The voices were different, though. Quieter. Like they're sleeping." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Or waiting. She gathered her materials and left the lecture hall, walking out into bright California sunshine that seemed a world away from the frozen peaks of Colorado. But she knew the mountain was still there, still waiting with infinite patience. The cave might be sealed, but the earth was always shifting, always changing. Ice melted and reformed, rock fractured and fell. And somewhere deep beneath all that stone, something listened to the mountain's movements, patient and eternal, ready to call out to the next person who came close enough to hear. Sarah had learned to live with that knowledge, to carry it without letting it consume her. But she also stayed vigilant, monitoring news reports from the area, maintaining contact with the sheriff's office, ready to sound an alarm if new disappearances began to cluster around Frozen Ridge. It was her way of honoring Jennifer's final warning, of making sure her sister's death meant something beyond just another statistic in mountain climbing accidents. As she drove home that evening, Sarah's thoughts drifted to David Brennan, the young man who had fought so hard to escape, who had tied a rope around himself as a physical anchor to reality, while the voices tried to pull him back down. He died trying to warn others, his message buried in ice until it was too late to save the next victims. Sarah wondered how many others had done the same over the years, leaving warnings that were never found, fighting battles that no one knew about until decades later, when the mountain finally gave up its dead. The sun was setting as she pulled into her driveway, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her uncomfortably of the crystalline glow in the cave walls. She pushed the memory away, focusing instead on the normal routines of evening, the comfortable familiarity of home, the safe distance from mountains and ice and voices that knew too much. But that night, like many nights, Sarah dreamed. She walked up Frozen Ridge under a clear winter sky, following familiar trails toward an entrance that shouldn't exist anymore. The collapsed cave had somehow reopened, its mouth dark and inviting against the white snow. And standing at the entrance, backlit by that strange crystalline glow, was Jennifer. Not the frozen corpse recovered by investigators, but Jennifer as she'd been at 23, vibrant and smiling, raising one hand in welcome. "Come down, Sarah," her sister called, voice warm with love and promise. "Come see what I've found. You've been looking for so long. Don't you want to understand?" In the dream, Sarah always took a step forward, always felt the pull of that voice, that promise of reunion and understanding. And always, just before she reached the entrance, she woke up with her heart pounding, Catherine's words echoing in her mind. "The mountain will take everything you give it, and ask for more." Sarah would lie awake in the darkness, reminding herself that Jennifer was gone, that the voice was a lie, that the real Jennifer would never want her sister to follow her into those depths. But the dream always returned, patient and persistent, wearing away at her resistance one night at a time. Because that was the true horror of what waited on Frozen Ridge. Not that it killed people, but that it made them want to be killed. It offered everything they'd been seeking, understanding, connection, release from pain, while slowly draining away everything that made them human. And some part of every survivor, whether they admitted it or not, always wondered if they'd made the right choice in walking away. Sarah rose from bed, poured herself a glass of water, and stood at her window looking out at the ordinary suburban street beyond. Thousands of miles from Colorado, safe in every measurable way. But she knew that distance meant nothing to the voices, that they spoke to her across the years and the miles through the medium of dreams and memory. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Marcus Holland, the deputy who had saved her life by pulling her away from the cave. "Still having the dreams. You?" His response came quickly, suggesting he too was awake in the small hours. "Every night, part of the price we pay for getting out. But we did get out, Sarah. That's what matters." Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that surviving was enough, that she could live the rest of her life without being pulled back to that mountain. But she thought about the classified files Agent Kim maintained, about all the other places in the world where similar phenomena waited, and she wondered how many people were living with similar dreams, similar prices for survival. The mountain had taken Jennifer and 6 others. It had claimed countless victims over the decades and probably centuries. And it would claim more, eventually. The collapse had bought time, nothing more. Sooner or later the ice would shift, the rock would crack, and a new entrance would open. And when it did, the voices would be ready, patient and hungry, and wearing the faces of everyone who had ever disappeared into those frozen depths. Sarah returned to bed but didn't sleep. Instead, she lay in the darkness and made herself remember the cold, the fear, the overwhelming pull of her sister's voice calling from below. She made herself remember because forgetting would be dangerous. The day she forgot how compelling those voices were, how perfectly they understood human weakness, that would be the day she might start thinking about going back. And going back, she knew with absolute certainty, would mean never leaving again.